Hello, my name is June. I am a bass music producer, DJ, sound designer, music educator, and today I want to talk about chord progressions. Chords can be kind of a confusing subject if you're new to writing music. We hear chords all the time, but it can be difficult to understand really what a chord progression does. The way I like to think about it is that a chord progression works as a harmonic scaffolding around which you can construct other ideas like melodies, bass lines, etc. And chords are one of those subjects that I could go on about for probably hours, but I want this video to be relatively accessible. So we're going to break it up into two separate parts. The first half is going to be me discussing the theory. How do I identify a chord's quality? How do I identify the chords in a particular key? What's the difference between a triad and a seventh chord? And then the second half is going to be me putting this into practice. How do we take this knowledge that we've built and make something that sounds nice? So in the process of describing some of the theory around chords, I'm going to open up my DAW and introduce you to some of the very basic chord qualities. A chord quality is basically a type of chord. Is the chord major? Is the chord minor? Is it a minor 7 flat 5 chord? Is it a minor 7 add 11 chord? Each one has a unique sound and evokes a different feel. So let's start on the note C. I have one of my own custom patches loaded up here. If you want this patch, patreon.com/June_Bernie. All $1 and up donations get access to all my packs. But we're going to start for all of these examples on the note C. The first set of 4 chords that we're going to discuss are called triads. These are 3-note chords, hence the name triads. A triad can start on any note. However, for the sake of this example, we're going to start all of our triads on the note C. And remember that a chord's quality is dictated by the relationships between the notes, not the specific notes themselves. And the first quality we're going to talk about is a major chord. Starting on our root note, a major chord has one note, 4 semitones above the root, and then 3 semitones above that note. And a major chord sounds like this. Hello, hello, hello. That's a major chord. If I want to make this chord minor, all I have to do is take this middle note and bring it down 1 semitone. Now I have a structure that starts with our root, goes up 3 semitones, and then up 4 more semitones. And it sounds like this. A minor chord is a little moodier, but ultimately sounds stable and pleasant. Next, we have a diminished chord. If I want to make a diminished chord, all I have to do is take this note and bring it down 1 semitone. Now I have a structure that starts with my root, goes up 3 semitones, and then up 3 more semitones. And a diminished chord sounds like this. It's very spicy. It's kind of spooky, and definitely holds a lot of tension in it. And we'll talk about how to resolve that tension later on in the video. And the last of these triads is the augmented triad. I'm going to take these 2 notes, bring them both up a semitone, which brings us back to our major chord. This isn't an augmented chord yet, but then I take this note, bring it up 1 more half step, and now I have an augmented chord. The structure we have here starts with our root, goes up 4 semitones, and then up 4 more semitones. And it sounds like this. The augmented triad to me has kind of an eerie alien quality to it. It doesn't quite have the same tension that a diminished chord does, but it definitely doesn't sound resolved the way a major chord or a minor chord does. So now let's talk about 7th chords. I'm going to build my major triad again. It's our major triad. And now up from this top note, we're going to go 4 more semitones. And now we have a major 7 chord. The reason it's called a 7th chord instead of like a 4th chord or something like that is because this note is the 7th in the scale. And we'll talk more about scales in a minute. But if I count up all of the white notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we have a structure that starts with our root, goes up 4 semitones, goes up 3 semitones, and then goes up 4 semitones. A major 7 chord is a lot like a major chord. It has kind of that peppy, optimistic quality to it. But the 7th adds a lot of extra color. Listen again. It actually has a little bit of tension to it, in my opinion. Now let's make this major 7 chord a minor 7 chord. I'm going to take the second note from the bottom, move it down a semitone, then take our 7th here and move that down a semitone. Now we have a structure that starts with our root, goes up 3 semitones, then 4 semitones, and then 3 semitones. And it sounds like this. I love minor 7 chords. I think they have kind of this warm quality to them. They don't quite have that tension the way a major 7 chord does. It's like a nice wool blanket or something like that. Next we have a dominant 7th chord. If I want to make a dominant 7th chord, I take this note from our minor 7 chord, move that up a semitone. Now we have a dominant 7th chord. And we have a structure that starts with our root, goes up 4 semitones, then 3 semitones, then 3 more semitones. And it sounds like this. This chord has a lot of tension to it. You may notice that the interval between this note and this note is quite dissonant. I'll delete these other 2 notes so you can hear it by itself. Dominant 7th chords play a very important role, and we'll talk more about that when we get into functional harmony. Last but not least, we have a minor 7 flat 5 chord, sometimes referred to as a half diminished. Jazz musicians like to call it a minor 7 flat 5 chord. Classical musicians like to call it a half diminished chord, so pick your side. To make a minor 7 flat 5 chord, all I have to do is take these 2 notes of our dominant 7th chord and move them both down a semitone. Now we have a structure that starts with our root, goes up 3 semitones, then 3 more semitones, then 4 semitones. And it sounds like this. This is also a chord that has a lot of tension to it. Now the diminished triad and the minor 7 flat 5 chord are often skipped over in beginner tutorials.
And that's a diminished chord, and it's used so much more rarely compared to major and minor that we're just not going to get into it right now.
But I don't want to leave them out because I think they have a very important role to play, just like the dominant 7th chord.
We don't need diminished.
Again, we'll get more into that when we talk about functional harmony. So to review, we have major triads, minor triads, diminished triads, augmented triads, and then for 7th chords, we have major 7, minor 7, dominant 7, and minor 7 flat 5. Each one has its own unique quality and its own unique amount of tension. Now we're going to table all of this information, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to build chords within a key. I'm actually going to make these red just to make them a bit easier to see. So let's talk about scales. Now, if you're an Ableton user, you probably know about the scale feature. You pick a root note, you pick a scale, and it highlights all of the notes in that scale. For now, we are going to stick to the key of C major. On a piano keyboard, this is all of the white notes, but you can also think of a major scale like this. We start with our root, then go up a whole step, then another whole step, then a half step, then a whole step, then a whole step, then a whole step, and then a half step back to the root. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, ti, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do. We know it, we love it, we've heard it a million times before. I find it helpful to think whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. Like you're giving your phone number. Whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, half step. And this is true regardless of what note you start on. So in this instance, I am in the key of F major. But again, we're sticking to C major. So how do I build chords in a key? Well, it's pretty straightforward, actually. All of these red highlighted notes are notes that are in the key of C major. But again, it's also all of the white keys on a piano keyboard. We're going to play our root. Skip one note, play the next note. Skip one note, play the next note. We have a triad. We're going to do the same thing here. Skip this note, play this note, skip this note, play this note. Same thing here. Same thing here. And now we have all of the triads within the key of C major. The chord qualities are as follows. We have a major triad, a minor triad, another minor triad, a major triad, a major triad, a minor triad, a diminished triad. Again, that's often the one that's left out. And then we go back to our original major triad. These two chords are the same, just displaced by an octave. Now the seventh chords in the key. I'm actually just going to take everything here, duplicate it across. Now on each of these chords, we're going to continue that process of skipping a note and then playing the following note. So skip this note, play this. Skip this note, play this. Skip this, play this. Skip this, play this, etc. all the way up the scale. Now the seventh chords in C major are as follows. We have a major 7 chord, a minor 7 chord, another minor 7 chord, a major 7 chord, a dominant 7th chord. Again, this is going to be important when we talk about functional harmony. A minor 7 chord, a minor 7 flat 5 chord, and then I forgot to add the 7th, but then we have a major 7 chord again. So as a quick review, major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, and then back to major. And then the 7th chords are major 7, minor 7, minor 7, major 7, dominant 7, minor 7, minor 7 flat 5, and then back to major 7. One thing I forgot to mention was minor tonalities. So for those that don't know, major and minor are actually kind of two sides of the same coin. And if I orient the major scale around the 6th scale degree, then I'll actually get a minor tonality. Of course, you could just go into the drop-down menu here and select your minor scale. However, for people who don't have a feature like this, they're working in a different DAW or they're working with an older version of Ableton, all you have to do is go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Take everything there, move it over, up an octave, and bring that over here. And now we have the minor scale. Right? And then, of course, you can take that one chord, bring it up here, and then you have the complete scale. So obviously all the chords are the same. We just start on the 6th scale degree. We have a minor chord, and then a diminished chord, a major chord, a minor chord, another minor chord, a major chord, another major chord, and then back to the original minor chord. Getting quite high there, so I'm actually going to take everything down an octave. And then the same for the 7th chords. If we simply start on the 6th scale degree, bring everything up an octave. Now we have a minor 7 chord, a minor 7 flat 5 or half diminished chord, a major chord, a minor chord, another minor chord, a major chord, and then we go back to the original minor chord, but displaced by an octave. So if you're trying to write something in a minor tonality to get something a bit moodier, this is how you might do that. It's worth mentioning that major and minor aren't the only scales that are derivative of the major scale. For more information on that, check out my video on modes. All sorts of interesting colors and stuff to be explored there. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about functional harmony right now. So for the sake of that discussion, I'm going to revert everything back to the major key, because functional harmony tends to revolve around major tonalities. That being said, we will discuss more minor harmony later on down the line. So functional harmony is basically a theory of understanding harmony that posits that different chords within a key have different jobs to do or different roles to play, different functions. There are three primary functions that we care about. There is tonic function, dominant function, and subdominant function. So tonic, dominant, and subdominant. And all of this is true regardless of whether or not we're talking about triads or seventh chords. Tonic function will be the first one we talk about. Tonic function chords tend to feel at rest. They're exactly where they're supposed to be. You can think about it like after a long day of work or school, you're stressed, you're tired, you come into your bedroom, you flop down in your bed, you take a big breath, and you feel home. That's what a tonic chord should feel like. And the tonic function chords in the major key are 1, 6, and 3. 3 is a bit of a question mark, but there's a lot of discussion around whether the 3 chord is actually a tonic chord, but for our purposes, let's just say it's a tonic chord. Dominant chords are the ones that have the most tension. They have a strong desire to resolve to a tonic chord. So again, using the example from earlier, the dominant chord kind of feels like it's 4 p.m., you're getting to the end of work, all you can think about is getting home and playing video games, but you still have an hour of work to go. That's what a dominant chord feels like. The 2 dominant chords in a major key are the 5 and the 7. If we look at the 7th chords, we see 2 unique chord qualities. We have the dominant 7th chord on the 5th scale degree, and the half diminished or minor 7 flat 5 in the 7th scale degree. And what makes these chords unique is actually this interval. It's the tritone. All sorts of interesting discussions to have about the tritone, but we'll table it for now. But it is a source of great tension within the major scale. Some might call it the engine that drives functional harmony. It is between the 3rd and 7th of the dominant 7th chord on scale degree 5, and it is between the root and the flat 5 of our minor 7 flat 5. Sources of tension, they want to resolve. Now, subdominant chords are familiar but have some interest to them. I sometimes describe them as a coffee shop or a restaurant that's nearby, but it's not quite home. It's still familiar, you're still going out, but it's not quite home. We can find subdominant chords on scale degree 2 and on scale degree 4. Again, these chords have some interest to them, but they don't necessarily have the same tension and desire to resolve that dominant chords do. You might even think of subdominant chords as a stepping stone between dominant chords and tonic chords. So you can use a subdominant chord to step up to a dominant chord or to step down to a tonic chord. So I know there's a lot of information to absorb here. We've talked about chord qualities. We've talked about triads and 7th chords. We've talked about major and minor tonalities. And we've talked about chord functions and functional harmony. So let's try actually putting some of this into practice. I'm going to keep this clip off to the side as kind of like a painter's palette that we can pull from, or like reference material. So I'm going to create another clip. Let's make this a fun green or something. And let's start with triads, just to keep things simple. I'm going to go with the most vanilla examples I can possibly think of. So to start my chord progression, I probably want to start at home. We're in the key of C major, so let's start with a C major. Beautiful. Now that I've established home, let's go somewhere a little bit more interesting. So let's go to like one of those restaurants or cafes that's nearby. Let's go to a subdominant chord. Quintessential subdominant chord is the 4 chord, which in this case is F major. And now we have this. We've created a little bit of interest here, but maybe now let's go back to a tonic chord. I think a good choice here is the 6 chord, an A minor chord. And finally, we want to create some tension that brings us back to the original tonic chord. So we could either do the 5 chord or the 7 chord. Again, I'm picking very vanilla examples here. Let's do the 5 chord. So by no means is this anything inspired, but let's loop it and take a listen. Something that's often a final step in writing chord progressions is figuring out our voice leading. If we think about like a 3-piece choir or a cappella group or something like that, we can think about 3 people singing each of these individual notes at a time. However, there's a bit of a problem, and it's that, the person singing this top voice has to do these massive leaps from here to here, and then here, and back down. It's a bit awkward. So what we can do is transpose these voices by octaves. So for example, if I take this C, transpose it down an octave, now we have much more smooth voice leading. This G goes up a whole step to A, this E goes up a half step to F, and this C stays exactly where it is. We can do this again with the A minor. I'll select these top 2 voices, bring them down an octave, and then these 2 voices will also come down an octave. Now we have this. Much more smooth, much more subtle, much more interesting. So it's worth mentioning that when we built these chords, we built them up from the root, right? And then stacked thirds in order to get the chord. This chord F major, we're not really stacking thirds anymore. However, we still call this an F major chord because it has the notes F, A, and C. No matter what order those notes appear, it is still an F major chord. There's a whole conversation to be had here about inversions, but again, we'll table that. All we care about is getting smooth voice leading from one chord to the next. So what about minor tonalities? All of the same rules still apply. And we'll build a new chord progression in a minor key. In order to establish a minor tonality in C major or A minor, depending on how you think about it, we should probably start on the chord A minor. So in the key of A minor, C major, A minor, and E minor are still considered tonic function chords. So all of the same functional harmony principles still apply. A minor is a tonic function chord, regardless of whether or not we're talking about C major or A minor. Let's do the same thing we did last time. Let's go to a subdominant chord now to create a little bit of interest. This time we'll go to the 2 chord in the key of C major, which is D minor. Now let's go back to a tonic function chord. How about C major? And finally, we want a dominant function chord to bring us back to A minor. So how about we do B diminished? Let's mess with our voice leading a little bit. So you may notice here that there's a bit of a problem, if you want to call it a problem. And it is that we have this leap from G to B. And no matter how I transpose things around, there's always going to be a little bit of awkward voice leading. But here's how we can justify this. We can say that we're doing an enclosure with this bottom voice. So what's happening is if we wanted to go from G to B with smooth voice leading, we would have to include an A between them. So what we're kind of doing with this bottom voice is called an enclosure. We're playing G, which is one whole step below A. We're playing B, which is one whole step above A, and then we're going back down to A. So we're kind of approaching this A from both sides, retroactively justifying this leap. And again, this is one of those things where if you want a leap in your voice leading, you can just have a leap in your voice leading. But if we're going by the rules, so to speak, then this is how we can justify it. Let's listen to what we have. Hello, this is June, but like an editing version. So at the beginning of the video, I mentioned 4 triads: major, minor, diminished, and augmented. And I realized that after I recorded the entire video that I never mentioned a use case for the augmented chord. And that might be confusing, especially because the augmented chord doesn't come up in the major or minor scales. So I wanted to demonstrate just a very simple use case. So I want to return to the very first chord progression we wrote, which was C major, a tonic function chord, F major, a subdominant chord, A minor, another tonic function chord, and then G major, a dominant function chord. So the augmented triad can actually act as a substitute for a dominant chord, most commonly the 5, which in this case is G major. So all I have to do is take this top voice of this G major triad, move it up 1/2 step, and I have a G augmented chord. Now I'm going to mess with my voice leading, and now we have this. So that augmented chord is admittedly a bit strange. Like I mentioned at the beginning, it's a bit alien. And I wanted to point out something that actually gives the augmented chord that alien quality. And that is that the augmented chord is a symmetrical chord. If I were to draw out all 12 notes in a circle, starting with C and then C sharp and then D sharp, etc., I could draw an equilateral triangle connecting 3 points, and that would represent an augmented triad. Now, I mentioned that an augmented chord can act as a substitute for any dominant chord, and here's where things get even more interesting. You'll notice that when I inverted this G augmented chord, if I analyze this up from the root, this is actually a B augmented triad as well. So it is equally valid to describe this chord as a G augmented chord as it is to describe it as a B augmented chord. You could even describe it as a D sharp or E flat augmented chord. Because we have this equilateral triangle structure, any note can be interpreted as the root. So that's just a very basic use case for the augmented chord. If you're looking for that alien quality, I recommend using it. So last one, before we move on to some other principles, let's write a chord progression using 7th chords. I want to work in a minor key again. Let's start with an A minor 7. This time, let's go straight to a dominant chord, just to mix things up. Let's do a G dominant 7, the 5 chord in the key of C major. Then we can do E minor, the 3 chord, again, another tonic function chord, in the key of C major. And then maybe a subdominant chord leading back to our A minor 7. This has a bit more of an ambiguous resolution. It doesn't have that same very clear, distinct tonic-dominant relationship, but it's still a resolution nonetheless. So how about we do D minor 7? Let's mess with our voice leading a little bit, and now we have this. This is cool. It has a bit more ambiguity to it. The subdominant chord, leading back to our tonic chord, doesn't have that same distinct push and pull that a dominant chord resolving to a tonic chord does. Almost as if it's a bit floatier, a bit more ambiguous, which is cool. You may actually notice that if you look at some of the chord progressions of pop music, having a subdominant chord resolving to a tonic chord is much more common than having a dominant chord resolving to a tonic chord, despite the fact that that's what the rules say. But that's just how music has developed over the last handful of centuries. So if you want some of that ambiguity, try resolving from a subdominant chord to a tonic chord rather than from a dominant chord to a tonic chord. So there's plenty of great music you could write using the techniques that I've just described. But let's spice things up a little bit. I want to talk about modal mixture, sometimes also described as borrowed chords. Let's return to these chord scales we made earlier. For the sake of trimming things down a little bit, I'm going to just get rid of the triads here, and we're just going to work with seventh chords for the rest of this video. Just know that all of the same principles that I'm going to be discussing also work with triads. Let's move these over here. And earlier we discussed relative major and minor. C major and A minor both use all of the same notes. But there's also a relationship called parallel major and minors. If relative major and minor is C major and A minor, parallel major and minor is C major and C minor. They both have the same root note, we're just building different scales off of them. Let's create our relative minor scale, just like we did before. And then move everything down such that the root note is also C. Now the chords we have here are C minor 7, D minor 7 flat 5, E flat major 7, which incidentally is the relative major of C minor, F minor 7, G minor 7, A flat major 7, B flat dominant 7, and then back to our C minor 7. So let's say, for example, that we're writing something in the key of C major. We're doing our functional harmony thing. We're moving between dominant chords and subdominant chords and tonic chords. But I want to create just a little bit more interest. What I can do is borrow one of the chords from the parallel minor. This is one of those things that has to be done tactfully. Otherwise, the tonality can be so ambiguous that it doesn't really feel like you're in a major key or a minor key. We want it to feel like we are firmly in one tonality and just occasionally borrowing a chord from another tonality. I should also mention that this doesn't have to be done with just major and minor. You can do this with any two modes. And again, for more information on that, video on modes. So let's construct a chord progression that borrows chords from a parallel mode. So all of our same functional harmony rules apply. I want to do something similar that we did in the last example, except in the key of C major. So I'll start with the C major 7 chord. This C major 7 has tonic function, so let's go to a subdominant chord, F major 7. Now here is where we're going to incorporate some of that modal mixture. I'm going to play an F chord again, but this time we're going to make it a minor 7 chord. The 4 minor in the key of C minor. Then let's do a dominant chord to firmly pull us back to C major. Let's do a G major 7, a very straightforward example. Mess with our voice leading, and now we have this. You can hear how this 4 minor is kind of an ear twister. It creates just a little bit more interest in what would otherwise be a very simple chord progression. Let's try this one more time in a minor key. So this time let's start in C minor and borrow some chords from C major. Start with a C minor 7. Now let's go straight into a borrowed chord. Now maybe we'll go to the 2 minor 7 flat 5, a dominant chord. Now, let's see. Then maybe the 4 minor, F minor 7. And then a G dominant 7, the 5 chord in C major. Do our voice leading stuff, and now we have this. So something interesting happened here, and you may or may not have noticed it. This 5 dominant 7th chord going to our 1 minor 7 has kind of a tonic dominant relationship. This dominant chord sets up a resolution to our 1 minor 7. Let's listen to that again. Hear that? So this actually brings us to our very last trick we can use to create more interest in our progressions, and that is secondary dominance. You can argue that what I've done here is set up a secondary dominant that resolves to our 1 minor 7. A secondary dominant is basically a dominant chord that's borrowed from the major scale of whatever chord we're trying to resolve to. I know that can be a little bit confusing, but bear with me. So let's create a new chord progression. Let's go back to C major. Again, start with a C major 7 chord. Then let's do a 2 minor 7. D minor 7 in this case. Let's leave this third measure blank for now because we're going to set up a resolution to our 4 major 7, which is F major 7 in this case. So the question becomes, if we want to set up a resolution into this F major 7, what are the dominant chords in the key of F major? So let's go back to our little painter's palette here. I'm going to take this major scale that we made, and I'm going to transpose everything up to F. So let's use the most straightforward example. The 5 chord in the key of F major is C dominant 7. So let's try that out. Let's mess with our voice leading. And now we have this. What if I want to resolve to a minor chord? Say, for example, this D minor 7 in the second measure. Let's delete this C7, C dominant 7. Let's move it over here. We could do the 5 dominant 7 resolving to the D minor 7 like we did in that last modal interchange example. That would be a perfectly valid thing to do. But let's do a resolution in the key of D minor, not D major. So let's go back to our painter's palette. Here, we have all the chords in C minor. So if I just bring everything up a whole step, now we have all the chords of D minor. So we have 2 options here. One is this dominant 7th chord a whole step below our root, resolving to D minor 7. So again, that would be C7, oddly enough, resolving to D minor 7. But let's try something a bit more interesting maybe. Let's do this E minor 7 flat 5, resolving down to our D minor 7, like so. Then our voice leading. And now we have this. Okay, so there's been a lot covered here. I don't blame you for being a little overwhelmed if it's a bit much. But just to review, we learned how to build triads in 7th chords in our major and minor scales. We learned how to identify chord qualities. We learned a little bit about functional harmony, then about how we can borrow chords from parallel scales or modes. And finally, we learned about secondary dominance. So that is everything. I really hope you found this useful. I really did my best to condense a lot of information, and I understand I went quickly through a lot of material, but ultimately I hope this was a helpful resource for people who struggle with harmony and chord progressions. Now comes the part where I say, like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell. Do I have a bell? I don't think I have a bell. I'm gonna check if I have a bell. I do not have a bell. Okay, so subscribe, don't ring the bell, because you can't. Check out my Patreon. I release monthly sample packs there. This month, it was a pack of neuro basses, which was super fun to make, and I hope that you will be back soon. Thanks.
Yeah, catch me at my darkest, feeling a spark to start shit. It's blood-stained fingers on a pen, feeling marvelous. But people already shown what is sown when you dig deep. 6 feet, if you can run away, grab some big cleats and fly, kid. Cause I'm designed to find dime shit with the timeless fangs. As a creature I bang, need I remind